Does God love me? That's a question that you could answer from several perspectives. For example, you could take a biblical or theological perspective on it. You may open the Bible to John 3:16 and read, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son." Well, as a theistic philosopher, I want to answer the question from a more philosophical perspective. That's not to say that that theological and biblical perspective is a poor one, just rather that the philosophical perspective is the one that I'm going to take on it. It's not my own perspective. It's rather a perspective that I'm going to be channeling thinkers like Bishop Robert Barron, but also more historical thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, as a philosopher, the first step that I always want to take is defining terms. So what do we mean by that term love? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that you could mean by that term. A lot of contemporary folks will use the term love to kind of make a warm feeling that they get inside of them when they're around someone that they love. We're going to set that definition aside. Rather, what I want to use is a more traditional definition of the word love, which is to will the good of the other as other. To love someone, in other words, is to will their good as another person. So let's think about this first in the context of purely human relationships. First of all, what that definition of love suggests is that if I love somebody, I can't merely will my good for them, right? And actually, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned here for good human relationships. We can set aside the questions about God entirely for a moment and just think about how this definition of love might be helpful for thinking about human relationships. If I will the good of the other as other, right? If I love them on that definition, then I'm not going to simply want the things that are good for me, for them. Rather, I'll want the things that are good for them. Here's an example, right? You might want to show your friend that you love them, that you care about them, and invite them out to dinner at a restaurant. But you might be kind of tempted to think, okay, I'm taking them out for a restaurant. I really like restaurant A. They'd probably prefer restaurant B. But I'm going to be paying. I'm going to take them out to restaurant A. Well, what are you doing? You're loving your friend. You're willing your good for them. You're not willing their good for them. You know that they would want to go to the second restaurant, but you're bringing them to the first because that's the one you prefer. All right, so we can kind of take the bigger picture here. And the lesson is this. When we love someone on this definition of love, what we're ultimately doing is we want their good for them as it applies to them. And we're not simply taking the things that are good for us and putting those good things on them and then willing those things for them. Okay, so that's the first lesson. The second lesson, and again, we're sort of staying in purely human love right now. The second lesson we can draw from this definition of love, willing the good of the other as other, right, is that sometimes that's going to involve going against things that they want. Sometimes, I'll say this again, loving someone means going against what they might want in the moment for their own good. Here's an example. You might be with a friend. Suppose you're out at that restaurant and they're all of a sudden reaching for their fourth dessert. If you really love them, you might recognize that that fourth dessert is not ultimately good for them, even though it might look tasty in the moment. So you might advise them, right? You might say, I don't know if that fourth dessert's going to be a good idea. Aren't you going to kind of feel sick later on if you eat a fourth dessert? What are you doing here? Well, you're overriding their immediate want, but you're ultimately doing it out of love in this sense. Why? Well, you're saying that passing desire that you have is ultimately not going to contribute towards your good. So in advising you not to eat that fourth dessert, I'm ultimately loving you. I'm willing the good for you. Okay, so let's turn and apply this definition of love to God. When we ask the question, does God love me? When we're working with this definition of love as willing the good of the other as other, the question turns into this. It turns into the question of, does God will my good? That's what it means to ask, does God love me? Does God will the good for me? And the answer to this, at least as it's been answered by traditional theistic religions, is a resounding yes. Why? Well, on traditional theism, God wills my very existence. He wills me into being. Not only at the beginning of time, not only at the beginning of my life, but in every moment of my life. On a traditional understanding of God, God is the thing. God is the reason for all that is. So he wills in every moment of my existence. He wills me into being. So he wills my existence, but he doesn't only will my existence, he also wills that my existence is good. He wills that I exist and that in my very act of existing, I'm a good aspect of his creation. That's at least the way that a traditional understanding of God would think about things. In other words, right, that God is the ground of my being. He wills me into being, and in willing me into being and in giving me existence, he wills goodness for me. What does this imply? Well, it implies that not only does God love me, not only does he will my good, he loves me like nothing else and no one else can. When I will the good of somebody else, when I love somebody else, I try and promote goods that have been given to them. I try and promote a good life for them based on who they are and what their life is and what their life involves and what's been given to them by God. By contrast, when God loves me, he gives me the goodness of my existence. In other words, my love for someone else is sort of a derivative love in some way. I'm willing the good that has been given to that person, whereas the love that God has for me is a very direct love. In willing my existence, he directly wills me into existence, and in doing so, wills the goodness of that existence. So, we can wrap up. Does God love me? From the perspective of a theistic philosopher, again, informed by the definition of love, informed by the understanding of God that I've just run past you, the answer is a resounding yes. And the proof here is a really, really easy one. If you've bought the way that we've talked about love, or if you're on board with that way of thinking about love, if you've bought the way that I've been talking about God as the being or the ground of my very existence, well, then it follows that the proof that God loves me is my very existence. For in my very existence, God, in giving me my existence, wills that that existence be good and therefore loves me. Hey everybody, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please click like or subscribe. It really does help. I appreciate your time. See you next time.